In March 1945, the German Ninth Army, one of the most battle-hardened forces in history, pointed its heavy artillery at 40,000 American soldiers preparing to cross the Rhine River. The German commanders watched through their binoculars, seeing a forest of steel. Sherman tanks, heavy howitzers, and endless rows of olive-drab tents. They gave the order. The earth shook. Thousands of pounds of high explosives screamed through the air, destined to turn the American front line into a graveyard. But when the smoke cleared, something impossible happened. The shells didn't hit steel. They didn't hit flesh. They hit rubber. A 33-ton Sherman tank suddenly somersaulted through the air like a child's toy. A massive artillery piece shriveled into a heap of deflated canvas. There were no screams of dying men, only the hiss of escaping air. On a muddy field nearby, a 20-year-old man named Arthur Schillstone pressed his face into the dirt, praying the Germans wouldn't notice the seams on his tanks. He wasn't a soldier. He was an illustrator. He didn't have a rifle. He had a paintbrush and a wooden roller. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. They were a collection of 1,100 artists, sound engineers, and designers recruited from the elite art schools of New York and Philadelphia. Their mission wasn't to kill the enemy, but to perform for them. They were an army of air, tasked with pulling off the greatest magic trick in the history of warfare. How did a group of art students convince Hitler's top generals that a balloon was a weapon of mass destruction? And what happened when the enemy started aiming real, lethal steel at an army that literally didn't exist? The answer saved 30,000 lives, but the secret was so dangerous, it stayed buried for 50 years. June 1943. While the rest of the world was busy training millions of men to fire rifles and drive real 30-ton tanks, a group of recruiters at the Pentagon was looking for something different. They weren't looking for the strongest men or the best marksmen. They were looking for the dreamers, the observers, the people who understood how light hits a surface and how shadows trick the human eye. They went to the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. They went to Cooper Union in Manhattan. They went to the Rhode Island School of Design. Imagine being 20-year-old Arthur Schillstone, a sophomore at Pratt, obsessed with illustration. His world was charcoal, ink, and oil paints. One day, he's in a classroom. The next, he's in a classified briefing room being asked one bizarre question. Can you make something look real that isn't? Arthur wasn't alone. He looked around and saw the future legends of American art and fashion. There was Bill Blass, who would one day redefine American style, currently peeling potatoes. There was Ellsworth Kelly, who would become a giant of the Museum of Modern Art, now learning how to inflate a rubber turret in under 20 minutes. There were architects, set designers from Hollywood, and even a radio DJ from Chicago. They were officially designated as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But among themselves, they were a traveling roadshow of deception. Their commander, Colonel Harry Reeder, didn't give them a standard military pep talk. He looked at these kids, the painters and the poets, and he made the stakes chillingly clear. Your canvas is a battlefield, he told them. In a normal unit, if you fail, you might lose your position. In this unit, if your work isn't convincing, real soldiers will die. If the enemy sees the seams on your tanks, thousands of men won't make it home. And remember, you will be on the front line with no real armor to hide behind. The room went silent. For the first time, it wasn't a game or a school project anymore. They were about to become the most vulnerable targets in Europe, protected by nothing but a layer of high-quality lies. To fool the Wehrmacht, a simple wooden cutout wouldn't cut it. The Germans were masters of reconnaissance. Their analysts were trained to spot the slightest inconsistencies in a grainy black and white aerial photograph. To win, the Ghost Army had to create a total illusion. They built it on 3 pillars: visual, sound, and radio. First, the visuals. These were the stars of the show. The inflatable rubber tanks. Each Sherman tank weighed only 93 pounds. You could carry a deadly weapon on your back like a backpack. 4 men could inflate one in 20 minutes using a simple air compressor. Up close, they looked like oversized pool toys. Some soldiers laughed, calling them parade floats. But from 3,000 feet in the air, through the lens of a German Messerschmitt, they were indistinguishable from 33 tons of lethal steel. Arthur Schillstone and his team were the detail men. They knew that a clean tank was a fake tank. So they spent hours in the mud, using wooden rollers to press fake tank tracks into the soil, leading exactly to where the rubber decoys sat. They poured warm water around the tanks to simulate engine heat melting the snow. They even hung laundry on lines between the rubber tanks because a real army is messy, and a German analyst would look for that lived-in look. Second, the sound. This was the voice of the Ghost. The 23rd had a signal service company that used 500-pound speakers mounted on half tracks. These weren't your average speakers. They could blast pre-recorded sounds of tank engines, bridge construction, and marching boots that could be heard 15 miles away. The recordings were made at Fort Knox, capturing the exact mechanical grunts of real armored divisions. They mixed these sounds in real time, like a battlefield DJ, adjusting the volume based on wind direction and terrain. If the sound was 10% off, a German listening post would realize it was a recording. If they realized it was a recording, the real American forces 10 miles away would be walking into a massacre. Third, the radio. This was the brain of the operation. Every military unit has a unique communication fingerprint, a specific rhythm of Morse code, a certain way of using jargon. The Ghost Army's radio operators were mimics. They would study a real division for weeks, learning the fist or typing style of their operators. When that division moved out, the Ghost Army stayed behind, broadcasting fake messages, supply requests, and casual chatter using the same call signs. To the German radio interceptors, it looked like the 30th Division was still sitting exactly where it was yesterday. It was a triple-layered lie, a masterpiece of theater where the stage was the European continent and the audience was the most dangerous army in the world. But as Arthur Schillstone soon found out, being a ghost didn't make you immortal. Because when the audience believes the performance is real, they start shooting at the actors. It almost felt like a game at first. A high-stakes scavenger hunt across France and Belgium. Inflate a tank here, play some records there, watch the Germans move their pieces on a map. But in September 1944, in a small town called Bettembourg, Luxembourg, the game ended. The 23rd was ordered to simulate a heavy artillery regiment. They set up their inflatable cannons in an open field, pointing their rubber muzzles toward the German lines. Arthur Schillstone was there, moving between the decoys, obsessing over the details. "The shadows have to match the time of day," he told a sergeant who was trying to rush him. "If the sun is at 10 o'clock and the shadow is at 2, a German photo analyst will know this is a lie in seconds." The sergeant just shrugged. "They're just balloons, kid. Relax." Arthur pointed at the gray sky. "From up there, those balloons are the only thing standing between us and the real artillery on the other side of that ridge." He was right. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the battery. Reports moved up the Nazi chain of command. A formation of 150mm howitzers rotated their massive barrels. They didn't see artists. They saw a threat that needed to be erased. At exactly 14:22, the first shells arrived. There is a specific sound a shell makes when you aren't allowed to fire back. It's a shriek that feels personal, like it's screaming your name. Arthur pressed his body into the freezing mud. He didn't have a tank to hide in. He didn't even have a real bunker. He had a foxhole and a prayer. The ground didn't just shake, it heaved. A direct impact hit a nearby position just 60 yards away. The blast wave was a physical wall of heat and dirt that erased everything in its path. When the dust finally settled, the field was a graveyard of rubber. Torn fabric fluttered in the wind like strange, pathetic flags. But among the shredded canvas, there was real blood. 2 men from the 23rd were gone instantly. Several others were wounded, their screams muffled by the ringing in Arthur's ears. These were men whose only weapon was a paintbrush, now facing the full iron fury of the German army. Arthur reached for his sketchbook, the natural reflex of an illustrator who had spent his whole life capturing the world around him. But his hand wouldn't stop shaking. He looked at the smoking craters where his art used to be. The operation was officially declared a success. The Germans had wasted hundreds of irreplaceable heavy shells on rubber and air. Real American units nearby had been left untouched, their men alive and safe because the Ghost Army had taken the hit for them. But as Arthur sat in his foxhole that night, drawing 2 small crosses in the margin of his notebook, the reality sank in. The rubber cost real lives. The great illusion required human sacrifices. And the biggest performance was still 6 months away. A mission so massive, it would either end the war or lead the 23rd into a total massacre. March 1945. The Western Front. The Allies had reached the Rhine, the last great barrier protecting the heart of Nazi Germany. On the other side sat the German Ninth Army, dug in, desperate, and waiting for the final blow. The Allied command planned a massive crossing called Operation Plunder. But there was a problem. The Germans knew exactly where the most likely crossing points were. If the Americans paddled into those teeth, it wouldn't be a victory, it would be a slaughter. Enter the Ghost Army. Their mission: simulate 2 entire infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th. That's 40,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and miles of supply lines. And they had to do it with just 1,100 artists near the town of Versen. For 6 days, the 23rd put on the performance of a lifetime. Arthur Schillstone and his team worked 36 hours straight. They didn't just inflate tanks. They created a living, breathing city of war. They set up field kitchens that pumped out real wood smoke. They hung laundry. They drove real trucks in endless loops through local villages, swapping unit patches and bumper markings every hour to create the illusion of massive convoys. They even sent actors into local cafes. Sergeants with fake 30th Division patches would sit just close enough to suspected German spies, accidentally leaking grid coordinates and complaining about the upcoming big push at Versen. But on day 3, Mother Nature almost blew their cover. At 4:47 a.m., a violent storm tore across the Rhine. Arthur was jolted awake by shouting. He ran outside and saw a sight that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so terrifying. A 33-ton Sherman tank was tumbling across a field like a giant green beach ball. It bounced over a hedge and landed upside down, its rubber turret pointing helplessly at the sky. If a German reconnaissance plane flew over at that exact moment, the secret was out. The war would continue for months longer. Thousands would die because a tank couldn't handle a gust of wind. "Stake them down," Arthur screamed over the gale. They sprinted into the freezing rain, wrestling with the heavy rubber skins. Arthur's fingers were so cold, he couldn't feel the adhesive. When the glue wouldn't set in the rain, he literally took off his own military jacket, wrapped it around a tearing seam, and tied it with wire. They hammered metal stakes deep into the mud, pinning the illusion to the earth. By dawn, the field looked normal again. The clouds held. The Germans saw nothing but a massive armored fist ready to strike, It worked. Across the river, a German general stared at his map. He saw the buildup at Versen. He saw the tanks. He heard the radio chatter. He made the fatal mistake. He ordered his elite reserves and his heavy artillery to move 13 kilometers south, away from the real crossing site, to face a ghost. Arthur Schillstone sat in his foxhole, looking at his rubber tanks. He knew the German guns were now aimed directly at him. He was the bait. And the trap was about to spring. March 24th, 1945, 2 a.m. For 5 days, the illusion held. Now came the only question that mattered. Did they buy it? 13 kilometers north of Versen, while German artillery continued to waste steel and fury on the Ghost Army's rubber decoys, the real 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions approached the Rhine in total, haunting silence. Thousands of boats hit the water. Engineers worked by touch and whisper. This stretch of the river should have been a fortress, defended by elite mobile reserves and heavy batteries. But those forces were gone. They were 13 kilometers south, staring at Arthur Schillstone's balloons. At 2:30 a.m., the first assault waves pushed off. The soldiers crouched low, expecting the far bank to erupt in a wall of fire. They waited for the mortars. They waited for the screams. But there was only silence. The first wave hit the east shore, boots on German soil. Then the second wave. Then the third. By dawn, over 40,000 men had crossed the Rhine. The last great barrier to Nazi Germany had been breached with casualties so low, military planners called it a miracle. 13 kilometers south, Arthur sat in his foxhole. The shelling had finally stopped. A messenger arrived with a single sentence from Colonel Reeder. It worked. Pack up. Arthur didn't cheer. He looked at the cratered field, the shredded rubber, and the painted tire tracks gouged by real explosions. He realized that somewhere north of him, tens of thousands of men were breathing, laughing, and writing letters home because the Germans had aimed at his art. When German forces finally advanced on the Versen positions, expecting to find the remnants of 2 American divisions, they found a nightmare of a different kind. A German officer stood over a torn Sherman hull. He reached out and touched it. It didn't feel like steel. It felt like a bathtub mat. He looked around and saw empty paint cans, silent speakers, and socks drying on a clothesline. There was no army. There was only air. Professional soldiers, veterans of years of brutal warfare, had been outmaneuvered by a group of art students from Brooklyn. But the most incredible part, nobody was allowed to know. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were sworn to absolute secrecy. Their files were classified top secret. Arthur Schillstone returned to New York and became one of America's most celebrated illustrators for National Geographic and Life magazine. For 50 years, he never told his neighbors, his friends, or even his family that he had once commanded a rubber army that saved a continent. It wasn't until 1996 that the records were finally declassified. Only then did the world learn the math of the Ghost Army. 1,100 men, 20 operations, an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives saved. In 2024, the final survivors, the few old men left who once fought with paintbrushes, received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. Arthur Schillstone once said that illustration is the art of tricking the eye into seeing depth where there is only a flat surface. On the banks of the Rhine in 1945, he and his band of artists proved that a well-placed shadow and a heart full of courage could do more than just trick the eye. It could change the course of history. The Ghost Army reminds us that in the darkest hours of human conflict, creativity is not just a luxury, it is a lifeline. Next time you see a masterpiece in a museum, remember, sometimes the most important art isn't meant to be seen. It's meant to disappear. If you found this story as incredible as I did, Hit the like button and subscribe for more untold history. And tell me in the comments, if you had to fool an army with nothing but art, what would you create?